Dundalk TV is with Dr. Parks in Annapolis in the Senate building at their exposition, and they're trying to help save lives. Dr. Parks, what does your exhibition deal with, and what kind of information do you have for the public that they can actually join you at a different time, since they more than likely won't have been here today seeing this video?
So the Maryland Committee on Trauma, which includes all the major trauma centers in the state of Maryland, is involved in a national collaborative through the American College of Surgeons Committee on Trauma to deliver a free public education on hemorrhage control. What we're hoping to teach the public are a few basic skills that everyone should know, and with that they can potentially help save lives in the potential of a life-threatening bleed from an injury, either be traumatic or through different kinds of accidents. There are just a few basic things that people can do using compression, packing, or tourniquet that they can use to stop bleeding and help save lives.
Okay, so what would be the first thing if you see somebody bleeding? Should you immediately call 911, or should you try to put something on if you saw bleeding, and then after you had tried to stop the bleeding, just for say 30 seconds, to put something on there, a tourniquet or something, then call the paramedics, 911 after that?
That's a really good question. So the very first thing we teach the public is to call for help. And I'll tell you that even in situations where you don't even have supplies available to even help, that you could, if once you call 911, either the fire department, EMS, or the police will come and they will bring kits with them. So even if you don't have anything available, they can bring them and you'll have some supplies there. But the very first thing you should do is, number one, assess for safety, and secondly, to call for help.
Okay, so for a tourniquet, well, I think everyone knows at this point in time, maybe a belt would work well. I would assume, just not even thinking about this before, but maybe a woman might have a purse with her. She might be able to use one of the straps or something like that for possibly if she has a big bag to use that. Even somebody with a knapsack, if they have something, they might be able to use part of that if they cut it off. But what about clothing? You said about packing. So if, take your shirt off and do that. So what was your recommendations on, being out in a situation like this? What do you recommend people to do to stop the bleeding?
So you bring up a very interesting question. We actually don't advocate for the use of belts or different kinds of materials that could be used as a tourniquet unless they were specifically designed to be a tourniquet. So the ones that we teach the public to use are actually military grade because they've been proven to be effective. A lot of the ones that are homemade or improvised are they take time to create, which could potentially lead to more bleeding, or they could fail. So even if you're trying to use a belt or, as you describe, a part of a purse, these are not designed for hemorrhage control, so we don't actually advocate for using them. If you don't have a tourniquet available, you can always apply pressure. You can always apply packing. We say that if you have some sort of gauze material, that would work, but honestly, any sort of cloth packed into a wound would work. So I would even take the jacket that I have off and stuff that into a wound if that's all I had available. You want to pack the wound tightly and then apply two-handed pressure on top for compression, and that would work better than any sort of improvised tourniquets, unless you have a real tourniquet available.
Okay, now a lot of times when people are injured, you shouldn't move them because that can create more injuries. But if somebody is really bleeding and they are kind of moving around anyway, I heard at one point in time, if you roll onto your right side, then your heart's up in the air, so your blood has to pump even harder to get to the heart. So if the person, would you suggest that they were moving around to have them on their left side so their heart was lower, so maybe it wasn't pumping as fast?
That's a very good question and a little difficult to answer without an exact situation, but what we advocate for is if this family member is bleeding to death, then stopping the bleeding is going to be the number one thing that's going to save their life. To help with compression, it helps to put them on a hard surface, so if they're on a sofa or a bed or something soft, you can put them on a table or on the floor, something hard surface, so that you can apply full pressure, all your weight if necessary, to apply compression.
Okay, any other tips you can give us? And then once you do that, any kind of contact information, because you had said that actually you have classes available for people that weren't able to make it today.
Sure. Yes, there's a lot of information that's available on the Maryland Committee on Trauma website, so www.mdcot.org. You can also contact your local trauma center, because all of the state of Maryland trauma centers have these courses available, and again, they're free to the public. I explained a few of the basic steps for basic hemorrhage control, but the best thing I think would be for you to actually enroll in a class and take it. It entails about a half an hour PowerPoint lecture, and then on hands-on training, we really focus on trying to use a tourniquet, learning what the parts are, and then learning how to recognize life-threatening bleeding, and then applying packing and compression skills.
Well, I should have really asked if, being a traumatic brain survivor, what about head injuries? What do you recommend on that?
For bleeding from a head injury?
Yes.
So I wouldn't recommend packing, because you never know if there's broken bone underneath it, and you can't really apply a tourniquet to the head. So the best thing to do would be to apply direct pressure, and with the two-handed technique, to apply pressure directly over the wound.
And if you had a jacket, would you suggest possibly wrapping if it was profuse bleeding?
Well, the wrapping helps hold dressings in place, but direct pressure over the site of bleeding is probably the best thing to do.
Okay.
Taking care to keep in mind that you want to make sure that you're not actually pushing against a fracture, because that could injure the brain.
Well, I really feel like I learned something from you today, and thank you very much for doing the interview, and keep up the great work. And Shock Trauma does wonderful things for Baltimore, and it's a pleasure to meet you today.
Thanks so much for having me.